So we're on chapter 22 of your United States history, section 6, Restoring Peace After World War I. We are going to touch on the Versailles Peace Conference, the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles, onto redrawing the map of Europe after the war, and how the United States will reject the League of Nations. So here we have some pictures here of the palace at Versailles, right outside of Paris, France, that Louis XIV built, but after the French Revolution, of course, the kings weren't there, but a beautiful place to sign a peace treaty, that is certain. And here we have the big four that were involved in this. We'll go over that in this video. Here we have Woodrow Wilson as one of the big four. And then how Germany had a hard time accepting the terms of the peace conference. And so having to pay a huge amount of reparations. So let's go ahead and begin. The Versailles Peace Conference. Well, before the Versailles Peace Conference, we had the armistice. Remember, the armistice was signed actually in a railroad car that stopped the fighting of World War I. But now they had to organize the terms of a peace conference, which that's that they did in January of 1919. Our president, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, went to Europe himself to be part of the American Peace Conference. Remember, he had it ready, his 14 points, and the League of Nations to present all of this at the peace in Versailles. So he was hailed as an international hero in France, in Britain, in Italy. As he toured Europe, everybody cheered, of course, for the United States and the president. On January 18th, 1919, at Versailles, just outside of Paris, would become the place of this peace conference, as I said before. So here we have pictures, the conference going on, and here we have the big four and Wilson being one of them. So the big four, okay, who were the big four? So, well, the European landscape was in ruins and there was much political upheaval. Communism now controlled Russia and threatened to spread. The conference made little progress as achieving peace between equals. So no representatives from the Central Powers were even invited to the peace conference, or to help, not to the peace conference, but to help draft the treaty of the peace conference. So after 2 months, the leadership fell to the four influential men. And the big four were President Woodrow Wilson, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of United Kingdom, Premier Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. It's a picture of these guys right here. So, and here you have a picture of Woodrow Wilson giving the peace for the League of Nations at the peace conference, a kind of cartoon. Here we have the big four here. In the midst of the big four, you have England's prime minister, as I said before, and France, and Italy, but no representative of any of the Central Powers at all. The League of Nations. Well, President Wilson felt the most critical step in world peace was to establish a League of Nations. He insisted that it be part of the treaty. He was willing to compromise on other points, even to get his league in. At Wilson's insistence, the delegates at Versailles appointed a special commission to write a charter for an international body. And this international body would be the formation, or the skeleton formation, of the League of Nations. President Wilson was personally responsible for the ideas that went into the League Covenant. And then on February 1919, the Versailles Peace Conference had approved a first draft, and later it would be set up in Geneva, Switzerland, of what this league would be, the League of Nations that President Wilson founded and put together. Did I say Roosevelt? I meant Wilson. President Wilson put together the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson. The League of Nations was a futile attempt for peace. On paper, the League looked like a final solution to world peace. If all men were truthful and good and all could work together, it would work out. But in practice, it would become just one more futile attempt to impose peace on people whose hearts are at war with each other. So their hearts are at war, so it was hard for them to accept peace or peace between equals. Americans actually distrusted the League entirely, even in America. So if Americans couldn't even trust the League, then do you think the European nations would? Well, President Wilson learned quickly that the peace treaty would face opposition in the United States, especially in the Senate. And many senators opposed the treaty because they believed joining the League would involve the United States in entanglement again with alliances of other countries of the world and possibly bring us into another war. So that's why they said, well, we don't really want to get involved in their dealings because we might end up in another war. So Americans were not really up on the League of Nations, especially, our Congress and our senators. They were against the League of Nations. Here it says, why did the League fail? And we'll see, first and foremost, the absence of the United States. The United States didn't join the League of Nations. And it meant that the world organization was really controlled by Britain and France. And so Germany wouldn't join, and Russia didn't join in 1934 when Germany left. Anyway, all of these countries were not really, okay with the League of Nations. You see the picture there of the snake, international, and the rabbit here, League of Nations. Really, is this going to happen? Here's another cartoon here. We have here's the League of Nations here with the peace, and this is the senators, and they're trying to get away from them. They say, see that horrible vulture? Take it away. Take away the League of Nations. And here we have, of course, President Wilson thinking, oh no, this is a failure. Here we have the League of Nations here trying to make peace, and then you have a huge European war with a huge sword here ready to fight despite peace. So some things, but the League of Nations would be the beginnings of what we now call the United Nations, which now the United Nations too have many problems and cannot hardly deal with peace. It's craziness there. Anyway, we're not going to get into the United Nations right now, but just know that the League of Nations actually was pretty much of a failure. So the Treaty of Versailles was a series of compromises with Wilson's 14 points. Just remember, 14 points. And other important provisions were also established from the 14 points on. First of all, that Germany would lose territory. So it would have territory losses. It would give up all of its colonies. Alsace-Lorraine was actually ceded to France. That France actually wanted it. That's an area that they were fighting over, Germany and France. Germany wanted to control it, so Alsace-Lorraine was ceded to France. French had the right to use this rich basin there for 15 years, and Germany also lost territory to Denmark and Poland also. So just think, Germany lost territory. Demilitarization of Germany. The army was reduced to 100,000 men. There was no draft allowed, and the Navy and Merchant Marine was very limited. No more submarines. And Germany, the territory of the Rhine was to be occupied by Allied troops. For 15 years, Allied troops would be in Germany, occupying that west of the Rhine to make sure that the Germans were not crossing into war again, basically to show the military strength of the Allies. The reparation and admission of guilt was that forced Germany to admit to the total responsibility for causing the war and to pay the entire cost of war damages that were set in 1921 as $33 billion. So they would have to pay $33 billion for the war. So Germany, not only that, had to give up its territory, it was demilitarized. Their military was put on zilch practically, and they had to pay $33 billion. So great problem for a lot of Germans, that's for sure. So here's a picture, the terms of the treaty. Many feel that the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were very harsh on the Germans. Some even go as far to suggest that this harshness would cause the rise of Hitler in the 1930s, and actually was part of the reasons, for the Second World War, would actually maybe even have caused the Second World War. Giving up their territories, putting them on zilch, and they're paying their reparations of $33 billion. They were in dire straits. So the Treaty of Versailles is here. This picture where it took place. See all the people there in front of the palace there. And this is the treaty that's supposed to end all wars, but it didn't. It was a very harsh treaty, and as I said, it took away the artillery of the Germans, and Germans could not have their submarines, no air force. They had lost all of their colonies and 25%, a quarter of their territory. That's a big loss for Germany. Germany's reaction to the treaty, well, you can imagine. When received the final terms, Germany protested. It did not reflect Wilson's 14 points. Is that what Germany said, we'll accept President Wilson's 14 points, but to them, it did not reflect what the United States had said. So Germany was humiliated to accept the total responsibility of the war. But facing the threat of invasion, they had little choice but to accept the treaty, which they did accept the treaty reluctantly. So on June 28, 1919, the treaty was signed by Germany. You can see here, again, the army was reduced to 100,000. The Navy only allowed 6 battleships, no submarines, all these things here. We went over this already. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France, but you can see here this whole area. So you can see as you look at Germany here, losing all of this area. These are all the area that Germany lost in the midst. And down here, it said terms the German people must pay for all the damage to civilians and all the damage on land or sea, every damaged country that the Germany must pay for. So, redrawing the map of Europe. So by 1920, the Allies signed treaties with the Central Powers. And so they redrew the map of Europe to attempt to carry out Wilson's principle of self-determination, basically nationalizing some of these countries, cultures that were very alike, or nationalities of the people in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Because of the broad scattering of various ethnic groups, the boundaries were pretty much artificial. So even though they had the boundaries, yet all of the certain cultures were not all in that certain boundaries. And many peoples of Eastern Europe were not able to even handle being politically free. They did not know how to set up their government in any way. So that was pretty harsh. Many peoples were not able to even handle political freedom at all. So the artificial division, the harsh treatment of Germany, and the attempt to promote self-government among people that were not prepared for having self-government created many problems. So some of the things, first of all, the artificial divisions, the harsh treatment of Germany, the attempt to promote people's governments on themselves, where they're not prepared for self-government. These all would cause and contribute to the outbreak of another war 20 years later, World War II. So here we have, let's look at this picture. So here we have before and after. So here's Germany, You can see Germany and Austria-Hungary here in the midst of, here's where Switzerland, Bulgaria here in the borders of France. And you can see down here Serbia and, you know, Montenegro, Romania. See, and you can see down here how everything changed. So basically we see now Austria-Hungary divided with Poland and Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. This whole thing with Yugoslavia and everything, later on, Yugoslavia will break up into like 6 or 7 countries because basically there were many ethnic groups in this group. And you see where Romania changed. You can see the boundaries changing drastically after World War I. The United States rejects the League of Nations. So ironically, the United States was the only important nation that did not join the League of Nations. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, he lived 1850 to 1924, of Massachusetts, was the chairman of the Senate and Foreign Relations Committee. And he was strongly opposed to the League of Nations. Here's a picture of Lodge, and this is a picture of Woodrow Wilson. And so he was opposed to the League of Nations. Of course, Woodrow Wilson had formulated the League of Nations, and he was behind trying to get it passed. So after long debates, the Senate approved a series of 14 reservations to the treaty. If 14 things were changed, maybe they could compromise. But of course, President Wilson found that the Lodge reservations were very unacceptable to him. So they couldn't come up with a compromise in the League of Nations at all. You see here again, here's the international and the League of Nations, this little bunny, it's going to eat the disputes, eating the League of Nations up, you know, and the American people wanting out of the League of Nations. President Wilson's speaking tour. So President Wilson realized the Senate was not going to approve it, so he went on a speaking tour to present it and appeal to the people through this speaking tour of what the League of Nations would be. And so he started this tour, but he did not convince the American people that it was wise for the United States to get involved in European affairs and politics. The people were done with war. They thought that getting involved in the League and getting back involved in Europe would not be a good thing for them. So they're like, we don't want to have anything to do with this, even though Wilson did a lot of work and traveling and trying to get them to, appealing to them to want to continue to pursue the League of Nations. Well, the strain of war, you can imagine on Wilson, here's a picture of him, and this peace conference and his tour took a toll on President Wilson. On September 25th, 1919, that's not too long after the war, he collapsed after delivering a speech in Pueblo, Colorado. He was giving a speech about the League of Nations and he collapsed. And they hurried him back in a train, and a few days later he had suffered a stroke that partially paralyzed his left side. So for many months, he was trying to carry out his presidential responsibilities, his wife having to help him very much, considering he had just had a stroke. And the illness lingered on until he died in 1924, a few years after leaving office. So definitely, he could not promote the League of Nations. And in fact, you know, his presidency was about over. He barely made it through his presidency, and then dying in 1924. Woodrow Wilson's speaking tour and his stroke. The Senate votes were to reject the Treaty of Versailles. We already know that, we went over. But on November 19, 1919, the Senate voted to reject the treaty. And then it was brought back into the Senate, and it was to be reconsidered, the treaty again. And again, it was rejected. And again, in 1920, it was rejected. On March 19, 1920, the Senate again rejected the League of Nations. And so America ended its hostilities through Germany instead in a joint resolution in 1921. But the United States never, ever ratified the Treaty of Versailles or never joined the League of Nations. So here we have it all set up as Wilson liked, but in Versailles, but the United States never ratified the treaty and never joined the League of Nations at all. So here we have the U.S. Senate and the Treaty of Versailles rejected by the Senate. And this picture here, and America has to sign a separate treaty with Germany that's outside of the Treaty of Versailles, which is pretty ridiculous, but they would not sign that treaty. And the U.S. Senate was rejected. Here it is, reservationalists in Senate liked the treaty, except for an Article 10 of the League of Nations. They didn't like the League of Nations. John Cabot Lodge, again, was against the treaty. Internationalists liked the treaty, but Wilson spoke across the country in favor of it, but collapsed in the partnership that killed the treaty. U.S. signed a separate treaty. So it's kind of a basically going over a summary of what I just said. So anyway, the Senate votes to reject the Treaty of Versailles. So, well, that's the end. We see basically from that point how Germany, being dissatisfied of what they had to do in their reparations for the next few years, would go into a big depression. And amidst all that, there would be a leader that would be raised as a dictator type leader to start another war, Adolf Hitler, and World War II would begin 20 years later.